Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindsay Wong, and I'm an author and associate professor of creative writing in the English department at the University of Winnipeg. I'm a Chinese woman with blonde hair, and there is a painting of maple leaves behind me. I want to welcome you to our very first event for a publishing speaker series. And today we are featuring a reading and Q&A with award-winning and best-selling author Jessica Johns, who wrote one of my favorite books of 2023, Bad Cree. So we're very, very lucky to have Jessica here today. Today's event will be recorded, so if you do not want to be on the camera, please keep your video off. We also ask that you keep your mics muted. We have a lot of questions submitted already, so we'll only turn to the chat if there is time. I want to thank the English department and the research office at the University of Winnipeg for your support of this event. Today, we acknowledge that we live and work in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji Cree nations. The University of Winnipeg sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of Anishinaabe peoples. As a settler of color writer, I'm not only committed to honoring and following the lead of the land, water, and cultural protectors of this space, but I'm also a constant and forever student of the remarkable stories and their tellings by Indigenous peoples here and around the world. So thank you for the space, and I'm very grateful for everyone for joining us today. And if you feel moved to, please share where you're coming from in the chat on Zoom. So we have the wonderful Jessica Johns, who is a very talented writer. And Jessica is a queer Nehiyaw auntie with English, Irish ancestry, and a member of Sucker Creek First Nation. Her debut novel, Bad Cree, was shortlisted for the Amazon First Novel Award, was a Canada Reads finalist. And for those of you who don't know, that's a really big deal in Canadian publishing. And it also won the WGA Fiction Prize. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jessica. We're just so excited.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for inviting me to be here. And yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you and your students today.
Thank you. To start the event, would you like to begin with a reading?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tansei, everybody, Pismo Square, Nitsiga son, Egwa Jessica Johns, Sucker Creek First Nation, Ochinia, Egwa Miskwichi Wiskaginik. So my name, as you all know, is Jessica Johns. My Cree name is Pismo Square. As Lindsay said, I'm a member of Sucker Creek First Nation, but I live and work in Miskwichi Wiskaginik, which is Edmonton, Alberta. That's where I'm coming from today. And I'm just going to read the first page and a half of Bad Cree. It's an easy, short 5-minute read. So if you want to follow along, if you have your book, just first page. Before I look down, I know it's there. The crow's head I was clutching in my dream is now in bed with me. I woke up with the weight of it in my hands, held against my chest under the covers. I can still feel its beak and feathers on my palms. The smell of pine and the tang of blood sting my nose. My pillow feels for a second like the cold, frozen ground under my cheek. I yank off my blanket, heavy like I'm pulling it back from the past, and look down to my hands, now empty. A feeling of static pulses inside them like when a dead limb fills with blood again. They are clean and dry and trembling. Shit, I think. Not again. I step gingerly out of bed as though the world in front of me might break and turn on the light. Wait for my eyes to adjust. It illuminates my blanket on the floor, the gray sheet kicked into a clump. Every breath I take is labored, and when I blink, my dream flashes onto the back of my eyelids. Running through the woods, the snow glistening in the clearing, the crows covering Sabrina's body. Heart thumping in my chest, I kneel next to the bed. I imagine I might if I ever were to pray. Come on, I plead into the covers. Where are you? I feel across the bedsheet for anything. Blood, feathers, twigs, small bones. My fingers shake and search by touch in between pillows, into every crease and wrinkle of the fitted sheet. I turn on the flashlight on my phone and use it to look into shadows, but I find nothing. My shirt, when I bring it up to my nose, smells like the outside in winter, like pine trees in sharp cold. You son of a bitch, come on. I kick the blanket to the side and put my cheek to the floor, scanning underneath the bed and bedside table. Dust and crumbs sit forgotten in dry corners. An old plate, mold forming across the ridges, lies next to holy socks. I close my eyes. My awake mind is trying to fog the dream over, shake it away, but I hold on to it. I know it was there in my hand. As real as the floor still against my cheek, I was holding a crow's head when I woke up. I can still smell the blood in the bedroom air and feel where its beak pressed into my palm, right above my heart line, throbbing and hot. And I'll end it there. And introduce you all to Caper, my kitten, who is gonna terrorize this entire session.
Great, thank you. It's so nice to meet your kitten as well. And that opening, I always get chills just thinking about it. And you wake up and there's like a crow in your hand. It's such a brilliant opening. Um, I'm just going to, I guess I'll just jump in with some questions.
Yeah.
And so with this, with Bad Cree, so you're acclaimed and award-winning best-selling author whose work is just it's so suspenseful, as you just showed us in the opening. It's also well crafted. It's literary horror, right? Which is such a hard genre to do. And it's also very thoughtful and gorgeous in its execution of family love and grief at the same time. So you're doing all these things, which is so difficult to do. And that's just a testament, I think, to your craft as a writer. For those of us in the audience, can you maybe talk about your path to becoming a published writer and what draws you to the horror genre?
Wow, those were all really nice compliments. So thank you so much. Yeah, I always felt I was always very drawn to story since I was a little kid. I grew up in rural Alberta, in northern Alberta, which I think I don't know, there's something about like living on the prairies. There's such a beautiful, it's such a beautiful place, and it's also um like it's also such a there's a lot of horror too. Um, I grew up like on farms, I grew up in isolated communities. And it's kind of like when you listen to like uh Midwestern emo, it's like there's just something that like comes out of these places that are sort of like in isolation, in particular, that I think just I don't know, you're able to see like the terrifying, I guess, in everyday life. And that just really seeps into your subconscious in a little bit, in a way. And yeah, my whole family are storytellers. I don't know if they would identify that way, but like, I grew up just like hearing how my family tells stories, in particular horror stories. I think the more north you go, the scarier the like scary stories are. So, me and my community were from Northern Alberta, and I thought we had the scariest like ghost stories. I thought we had the scariest stories from like anybody. And then I started hearing stories from the Inuit, and I was like, oh, we don't hold a candle. Like, they have like scary, scary stories. So that was just sort of, I didn't really think too much about being a writer, but I definitely was really, really interested in story. And the only things kind of in our house growing up too, the only like literature were, my dad was a really big Stephen King fan. So I just read what was there, and that happened to be Stephen King. And um, so I feel like I got another sort of introduction to horror at a very early age, and I was always really fascinated by it and really just interested in the genre. And then as I grew older and realized that like writing and being a writer is like an actual career path for people that people can take, which wasn't something I knew my whole life. Um, I started to think about what I was really interested in, and what horror looks like for me as a Nehio, as a Cree person. Um, which, though I love the horror genre, there's a lot in the history of the horror genre that really centers and caters to a white audience and thinks about what horror is for white people. And so I was really interested in telling stories about what horror is um, for a Nehio Squale.
Well, that's so interesting. And I love how you were able to bring in Stephen King, because we have a lot of fans here in the class. And at the same time, you merge Indigenous horror, right? And you make it your own. And I think that's really inspiring. Um, yeah, I mean, do you find that Indigenous horror, it's kind of scary, right? To think about, more so than clowns in some ways, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Chinese horror, we have people that eat you, but I don't know about Indigenous horror, like,
Hey, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
cannibalism, right? It's
Yeah.
really popular. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really terrifying. I also think, like a lot of like traditional stories, scary stories, at least, we have ones that come from like our creation story, that are really scary, but um, we have other stories that we tell that are like for to teach lessons, or like to warn children, or to like not go into the woods, or something to like impart some sort of lesson to keep people safe in a way. And so to think about horror in that way as like a warning
Mm.
is also really interesting to me, and in particular because I think, I mean, there's an explosion of like great Indigenous horror writers. If you think of any of the writers in Never Whistle at Night, which is a Indigenous horror anthology, which is really brilliant. Alicia Elliott with her like psychological thriller horror book, and then She Fell, um, and various others. I think the another common thing is that like the big bad, or like the big horror, is always more than just like sort of like a clown, or like a murderer or whatever. It's like a very insidious, um, the violence of colonialism, how that shows up in everyday life, and how insidious that violence is. I think that's like the ultimate horror. And so how, yeah, Indigenous writers are sort of speaking to like this sort of global horror, talking about like, um, yeah, ecological grief and ecological horror, and like all these things, is that to me is so terrifying. Um, you know, so it's really cool, I think, what we're seeing come out now.
Great, thank you. I loved all those. The novel, Alicia Elliott's novel is also really brilliant.
Mhm.
So for our students and new writers, could you maybe tell us what it's like having such a successful debut book? I know we were chatting a little bit before everyone got here. So what was the publishing and promotional experience like? What was it like being on Canada Reads?
Oh, yeah. Well, so, my publishing experience was actually, really great. Um I think that I was lucky enough to have really great community and mentors, and particularly people who had already published. And so I was able to gain a lot of like advice around how to navigate the sort of the publishing world, which is like its own beast. And as a debut author, as somebody who hasn't published a book before, you don't know what you don't know. Um, so I think one of the greatest things was I was just I really advocated for myself and my choices. So there were just some choices within Bad Cree, like the concept for the novel cover, for example. Many of your students who like Stephen King will have already seen the sort of like 80s, 90s horror inspiration, Stephen King inspiration for the cover. Um, like having the syllabics on the cover as well as throughout my you know, using Nehia Wewin, the Cree language, throughout the text, and not translating or not italicizing those words. Um, all these and there are many others, like very conscious choices that I made throughout, that when my editor or one of the copy editors would suggest something different, I was able to really advocate for myself and really advocate for these decisions because they were so intentional and so grounded in sort of a cultural understanding of like how I wanted this story presented. And they were really great about it. Like I didn't have to fight anybody. It was just like yeah, it was very respectful, and I loved that. I feel like that's a really beautiful experience to have, and not I know people who have not had that experience in publishing. So that was really great. And Canada Reads was really stressful. It was a very, very stressful experience. It was quite overwhelming. Obviously, it's really wonderful to have. I love the format of Canada Reads, like having literature like debated on a national stage, I think is really cool. I'm a huge reality TV person too. I love reality TV. So also combining the element of, reality into something, probably the closest I'll get to ever being on reality TV, my book being on something. So, I was really excited by that and about the stage that it got. But it's really hard to let your your work, your sort of baby, be in the hands of somebody else. Like you don't have any say in how they're going to advocate for your book. You have no control over what the other people are going to say. You have no control over what the Canadian public are going to say. And that can all be very scary. So it was overwhelming, but it was ultimately good, I think.
Yeah, it's really good advice. When your book comes out in the world, you certainly have no control, right? What people say. You can't control any sort of reaction. And it's always nice to know that there are publishers out there who are going to let you have a voice and advocate for your work. Because I know so often students always tell me, like, what if I don't like what the editor has to say? Can I do anything about it? And it really, really depends on who you're working with and the publisher, right? Because so often newer writers don't want to be seen as difficult, right? You don't want to be seen as that person who's always going to say no. And that's really great to hear that your experience was so positive.
Yeah, and I think, there's a balance. I worked with editors who were incredibly talented, and it's such a gift to be able to have another set of talented and experienced eyes on your work to be able to say like, you know, hey, there's a hole here, or this isn't quite working, or whatever. Like that's all so helpful. And I think there's like a really important balance of advocating for your decisions because they're intentional ones or because you're trying to do a particular thing. And also being I guess open and curious and willing to like collaboratively work with somebody else on, because there were many, many things I did with Bad Cree that were wonderful. Like I made changes that were great suggestions. So it was really just figuring out in my brain, like, okay, am I going to push back on this because I really want it to be this particular way, or am I pushing back on this because like I just don't want to do the work to make the change? Because, you know, once if you have a full novel, once you start pulling at a string, there's lots of other strings you also have to pull at or mend. So making changes is like it is a lot of work. And so I think you have to really be, yeah, it's a balance. You have to be open and also yeah, advocate for yourself.
And that's really good advice. I think it's a collaboration between writer and editor, but it's also a really, I guess, respectful dialogue, right? Knowing when to push back and
Yeah.
when to set those changes. Speaking of, I guess, bad writing advice, I read in your interviews that Bad Cree started because something someone said. It was a creative writing prof at UBC, and I'm so curious. I'm going to ask you probably afterwards who it was. Can you talk about that further? And I think that's really important to recognize that, your professors sometimes will not give you advice that is helpful. Even I tell my students, all my advice is meant to be taken as suggestions, right? I'm not saying this is how it is, right? And I'm so curious about that.
Yeah, and I think too, just like there's going to be writing advice. I don't think it's just not a one size fits all. Like there's not, I think when talking about writing, obviously you talk about it from your own experience and what has worked for you. And that's just not going to work for everybody. So I think in this particular instance, this professor had said as if it were fact, like, oh, never write about dreams. Like, don't write about your dreams, don't write a dream sequence in your book because it will lose readers. It will bore readers, you'll lose them. Like, it was like that was the advice. And I think if anyone ever gives like advice that is very like never or always question that, because that's just like there's always exceptions to any rule. And first of all, dreams in it's a very popular craft technique in particularly horror. It's used all the time. And there are so many examples in horror: Haunting of Hill House, um, Nightmare on Elm Street, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like dreams are very popular, plot um, plot techniques. And that aside, for Cree people, they're also like a really, really big part of our storytelling. Dreams are very important. And so to hear from somebody that they don't have a place in story was like immediately I was like, well, I know that's wrong. I think that's really irresponsible to be, offering to be saying that that's the case. And of course, he didn't have any he said it flippantly almost like, it's not anything he's really thought about. That's like his understanding of using it. That's his background. But yeah, it just annoyed me. So I was like, I am going to write a short story that um, centers dreaming, and it will be interesting, and it will be exciting for readers. So it was kind of a way to push back against that.
I love that story, and I think it's so important to recognize that, sometimes people don't give advice that is helpful, as you mentioned. And I think that's really interesting that Bad Cree actually started as a short story and you were able to expand it, because some of our students are working on short stories and some of them want to write novels. So there's like flexibility there. So it's very
Yeah,
interesting.
totally. I think, I mean, for me, I love short stories. I've written many, and some of them, I write them and they're just, I'm done with them. That's like the format they want to be. And this particular story I wrote, and I was like, this story wants to be something else. Um, it's not sort of done in this particular format. And I think it's important to listen to that. Sometimes just the story will tell you.
Yeah, it's important to really trust your gut and your instinct. So speaking of writing advice, some our students are currently working on creating characters right now. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for someone who might be stuck on creating a character. So for example, Mackenzie, how did it come about? How did she come about?
Yeah, I think I've actually started doing something and I did it a little bit in Bad Cree, but I sort of had a concept of a character and I wrote the story to figure her out. And now I want to know for my next project, I really want to know the characters really well before I get too deep into it. So what I've been doing now is actually starting like character boards. And you can do them anywhere, Canva, Pinterest, if that's you, whatever you use. Um, and I think just spending really intentional time, just making just even like what seems like innocuous decisions about the kind of person they are, I think can be really helpful. So like everything from like what kind of music do they listen to? How do they take their coffee? What's their family dynamic? What's their relationship with their parents? How do they dress? What's their, like so then sort of getting like visual examples or creating that board to be able to refer back to when you are stuck and you're like trying to figure out how a character would respond verbally in a conversation, how they would respond physically. Also, I think figuring out their star sign is really important. So it's like if you know somebody is a Taurus, so many decisions are made for you. You know how a Taurus is going to respond in this particular, like it's just like I think helpful to figure out your character in these small ways. And then when you're stuck, be able to go back to that character and really think like, okay, how would they respond knowing all the information that I know?
That's really great advice. I love that idea of figuring out someone's star sign. That should be an assignment that I'm going to make students do, right? Create a character based on astrology horoscope. I'm going to add
Yeah,
that in, I think, for next year.
for sure. Like I think like Mackenzie is definitely like a water sign of some kind, she's very in her feelings, very emotional. Like a Cancer or Pisces or something. It's a fun thing to do. I highly recommend.
Amazing. Thanks so much. And then in the novel, text messages play this integral part. And I'm curious how you decided to incorporate the form of texting as part of the structure. I mean, it's very millennial, I think, to have text be part of a novel. Can you talk more
Totally.
about that?
Yeah, actually, this was really inspired from Leanne Simpson, who in her short stories, she's an Anishinaabe writer. She wrote this accident of being lost and various other books. She's a really, really big inspiration for me generally. And in an interview once, she said, you know, it's really interesting when Indigenous writers or Indigenous creatives incorporate technology into their work, because a lot of the time the response will be like confusion, because in people's minds, often Indigenous people are really relegated to history and the past, and like a contemporary understanding of like how we live our lives and how we are is like not within the colonial imagination. And so I was thinking a lot about that and thinking like with the technology we have today, if there was a way for our ancestors or for spirits to talk to us, to communicate with us, because they've been finding ways to communicate with us for, you know, since time immemorial, like what would that look like? And so it was just like, so, you know, I was really thinking about that. And then also it was just, it's such a fun, it was such a fun thing to add to the story, you know, it's like just another fun element. And it was really fun to write.
Yeah. And it's just so creepy though to think that someone from the dead or some kind of entity is texting you. We recently read Doretta Lau's Goddamn How Real Is This? And the future self texts someone 5 times a day. Um, and then I had students tell me like what would they would do. And so many of them were just like, we're just gonna hit mute, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to find out what's going to happen. I don't know. Yeah, I think I don't know if I was in Mackenzie's situation, I would probably just like try to get a new phone. I don't know if I could handle
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. Totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
I would have thrown that phone into the ocean for sure.
Yeah. But your character doesn't, and that's why you have such an amazing story, right? Yeah. So in the beginning, you mentioned that writing wasn't something that you thought of doing professionally, and many of our students at Winnipeg, they come from immigrant or working class backgrounds. So do you have any advice for students who love writing, but they feel that a literary career is just out of reach because of, financial reasons or other sorts of reasons?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly how I grew up. Like I grew up in yeah, small towns in northern Alberta, um with a working class family, with a working class community within a working class community. I didn't know any writers or artists. At least people who didn't identify that way. I think there were many actually brilliant creatives in my community, beating you know, the way that like my mom's a really big sewer and things like that, that I didn't actually, because it was all for utility, I didn't ever actually think of it as creative, which both those things can exist at the same time. I know now. But yeah, I had no conception of writing as a career, as a viable career, until, you know, being in university and really getting sort of uh like actually being exposed to writers who do make a career out of it, and you know, writing professors who really encouraged me to follow that path because it was something that I was very interested in. So I mean, I guess like my advice would just be to get curious, you know, like particularly being in university where the opportunities to be exposed to writers or other creatives, um, and ask questions about what that career path looks like, and you know, what options are available to follow it. Um, I think, yeah, just dig into it a little bit more, because you know, it's well worth it. I'm really glad that I followed my like heart.
Yeah, the career path it's a pursuit of passion, right? Because no one tells you when to wake up in the morning and write. You have to really want it.
Oh yeah, you have
Mhm.
to really place, you know, you have to have self accountability and you have to, yeah, place your own, you have to figure out your own schedule for writing, and you don't have like an outside person giving you deadlines unless you do. And that that is something to that can be hard, and it's something to figure out as well.
Yeah, it's really good advice. You talked a little bit about your influences, and in my workshops, we always talk about literary genealogy. And I'm wondering if you might discuss how some of these literary grandparents or cousins or aunties might have helped shape Bad Cree and any future works that you're working on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Eden Robinson is a huge inspiration and I would say influence for me. Yeah, she like for me seeing like Indigenous horror, like she was the first person I saw doing that. So, you know, she loves gore and incorporates horror elements into her works. And so she's certainly one. I mentioned Leanne Simpson. I think not the horror elements, but just the way she writes, the style that she writes is something that I really love. Alicia Elliott is a big inspiration for me. And yeah, I think those and Katharina Vermette. Katharina Vermette has been a big inspiration and also a mentor as well.
Amazing. And also a UWinnipeg grad. So there you
Yes.
go. Great, thank you. Really loved Monkey Beach. That was my first Eden Robinson book.
Yeah, Monkey Beach is really great. And she, yeah, again, like tension. Yeah.
Storytelling, right?
Storytelling, she
That
has
makes a great writer.
yeah.
Yeah. The ability to make us engage for the whole 300 pages, as I tell my students. An interesting question that was brought up in class is writing unlikable characters. Audiences are always saying we love unlikable characters, but then they suddenly get all these reviews, right? And they're saying like we hate unlikable characters, they're unkind. In your work, I'm wondering, do you see any advantages of writing unlikable characters? And do you think that female authors of color tend to get more pushback about having unlikable characters than white male counterparts?
I mean, definitely. To the second question, um, I think BIPOC women in particular get more pushback about pretty much anything in the literary world that their white male counterparts get away with or like aren't criticized for. And I don't know, the unlikable characters question is a really interesting one to me because I don't think I ever set out actually to write an unlikable character. For me, what's more important is writing a complex character. What's more important is writing a character that isn't just one-dimensional, and that means having that like people. Every character has flaws. And so sometimes those flaws are really annoying. Sometimes they're, in Mackenzie's case, avoidance and, you know, like severe avoidance. And, you know, inability to make decisions sometimes. And that's a flaw. That's something that propels the narrative in many ways as well. And but I think, yeah, I think it's important. What I try to do when I am figuring out my characters is to figure out, you know, what is redeemable about this person, or what are some good, and this goes vice versa. If there's like, I don't think it's also beneficial if you have like a quote unquote bad character or whatever, that they're all bad. Like we need some dimensions there and some complexity. Because I think also as readers, you care more about characters that are complex than ones that are one-dimensional.
That's really good
Whether
advice.
likable or not. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that when you suddenly add complexity and flaws, a female character suddenly becomes unlikable. Like, what does that even
Yeah.
mean, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm also curious because there's some of our BIPOC students are wondering if there's a certain expectation for them to write about certain subjects and to follow cultural narratives in order to be successful in mainstream publishing, right? Because often gatekeepers are white. Sometimes even professors don't understand cultural references. For example, someone telling you not to write about dreams, right? Which is an absolute, and it's obviously bad advice because your book is so successful, right? Um, do you have any
Yeah,
advice for them?
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think honestly, I think it's really important to be to come from a very genuine place when you're writing. And so if you're writing something because you know that these gatekeepers, this is the kind of story they're looking for from your particular cultural group. Yeah, I don't know. I believe that I think that readers are really smart and that people are going to be able to see any kind of just yeah, any element that's just like not that doesn't feel real. I think um even in fiction, I think people are really able to tell whether this is like something that comes from like your a heart place or not. And so yeah, I think it's important to write the stories that you want to tell regardless of what those gatekeepers are expecting from you. Because there was like a long period of time where no publisher wanted to, publish anything about Indigenous joy because they just wanted to hear about Indigenous trauma. And so that was the only thing getting published because that's what they deemed acceptable to be like consumed. And, the pushback of that has been many Indigenous writers writing about Indigenous joy and Indigenous happiness and Indigenous love. And those are like works of art because they're coming from a place of like, regardless of what these gatekeepers want, this is what I want to write about. And so I think it's important just to, again, just to be, to advocate for yourself and your story.
That's really important. Yeah, because sometimes they always say it's about the market, right? And then if you just show the publishers that there is an audience for this, sometimes it works. Like for me, I couldn't get published until Crazy Rich Asians suddenly became a thing. And then they said, oh, people want stories featuring Asian people who are not just playing mahjong and being sad, right? Of course, it's so interesting to me how publishers sort of see their audiences, right?
Yeah, and it's sort of something that has to be like, I'm always wondering, like, where are you even getting your data? Because
Right.
it's also like, if you're getting your data from a particular group, then yeah, that data is not going to show that um, this story is actually one that will be really important to people. So but yeah, I think, yeah, thinking about like the market and readership is a very interesting and complex discussion too.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So speaking of that, for the aspiring writers out there, I always get this question: should we be thinking about our audience, about how our work will be perceived while we're writing? Because I think there's something very special about a first book, right? You're not thinking about who will read it, who's my readership, right? And I think for me, it's always about protecting that space. But is that something to think about while you're drafting, or is it something to worry about much later in your
Yeah.
experience?
I think that if you think about that while you're writing your first like draft and first words, you're going to run into walls constantly and it's really going to get in your way. So I think it's something to think about later. I think when you're a couple of drafts in, you can start bringing in those. And when you have those questions, like, is this whatever as they come up, like write them down, put them somewhere so you can refer back to them later. But there's going to be a later point where you can go through and ask those questions and think about perception and think about your audience. And that time is not in your first draft, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's you have to protect that space, that creative space. I think it's really important. A lot of students have been asking, I guess because we were speaking of publication, how does one go about publishing, and how do you know if you're ready to submit?
Oh, honestly, I mean, there are so many things. I would say, like, just don't worry about perfection. If you are going to hold on to a piece because you need it to be perfect, whatever that means to you, at least for me, like, it'll never go anywhere. There's just a point where it's like, okay, this is good enough. This is like, uh, yeah, you just look for open calls, look for magazines that you like, that you actually love the writing in, or you like the values of what the mandate is for that magazine, and submit. Because I think also there's a period of like working with an editor too, where if your piece isn't, exactly perfect or whatever that means to you, you're still going to have an opportunity to work on it with somebody. And so, like, you kind of want to give yourself and that piece a little bit of grace.
That's really good advice. It's that perfectionism, I think a lot of first time or newer writers have, right? And the piece will never be perfect, right? You'll come
No.
back as a different person and look at it again, and you'll realize, like, 5 years later, I wish I had fixed that, and that's okay.
And yeah, I think that's gonna happen. I mean, I look at Bad Cree and I'm like, I would have done like, there's a bunch of things I would have done differently. Like, you're always nothing is ever going to just live, and you're gonna be like, it's perfect forever. So I think it's just something to sort of let go of.
Yeah. And when you were, I guess, submitting Bad Cree, I think there's a question here. Someone was wondering, did you have to query an agent? Did you just meet your agent through school, or was it sort of like a cold process of querying?
Yep, I queried my agent. So I queried a couple agents in order to, because, like, the querying process is that that agent reads a couple pages of your work, and they'll either want to see more, or they'll be like, this isn't, a fit for me. And so I queried a couple. I had conversations with a couple people, and the person that I ended up going with was just, when I talked about my vision for my career and what I wanted to do, she was really supportive about that. It's important you're on the same page. And then she had my full manuscript of Bad Cree, and we worked on that together for a couple of rounds before she then sent it out to publishers.
And then the rest was just an amazing, I guess, debut year and tons of readers and Canada Reads. So that's such a really great, successful story, and inspiring too, I think, for a lot of people. A student was asking, do you have any tips for taking criticism in a way that improves your work, but also maintains your voice and tone as yours? So I guess that goes back to the idea of respectful collaboration, right, with an editor or someone giving you feedback.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to, like, again, getting another set of eyes, particularly when you're out of school. Like, when you're in school, you have this, especially if you're in classes where you do workshop and things like that, such a gift. Because when you're not in a space like that anymore, hopefully you've developed a community of writers where you can sort of continue doing that. But it's such a gift to have, to get feedback on your writing. And some of that feedback will be really good and really valuable, and some of it just won't be for you. And I think just checking in with yourself and really, like, taking your ego out of it and being like, is this a good suggestion? Will this tell the story better the story you're trying to tell, will this do that? Or will that not do that? And really just checking in with yourself to see. And yeah, making sure you're not like saying no because you're precious about your work. And you're saying no because you don't believe that will serve your story. Or, you know, you're not saying yes to everything because that will completely strip you of your voice if you take on every single piece of criticism, or change or whatever. So yeah, I think it's just about being discerning.
It's being honest, right, with yourself and your vision for the piece. And becomes easier after a while, I think, to be able to say no, right? It's sort of
Yeah, you have
process.
to get to know yourself and your writing a lot. And sometimes trying things. Like
Mhm.
there was editorial advice that I got for Bad Cree. One of them was to change the beginning of the story to start in the dream instead of when she wakes up.
Mhm.
And I didn't know about it. I was like, I don't know if that's how I want this book to start, but I'll try it. So I tried it. I wrote a full scene where Mackenzie starts in the dream, and that the whole scene is her in it instead of her reflecting on it. And then I wrote it, I had it there. I read it, the first chapter, like with the elements of the first chapter. And then I was like, yeah, I like the other version better. So I scrapped it and went back to her waking up and then reflecting on the dream, like as she got ready for her day. And sometimes you just have to try things to see if they sit right with you and sit right with the story.
That's good advice. It's sort of it's trial and error and being able to put something in another document and coming back and maybe using it later on, right?
Yeah.
And it's so interesting because they always say don't ever start with waking up, right? Because of the cliche. And you've just gone ahead and done it, but you've made it your own. So again, there are no writing rules, I think.
Yeah.
So interesting. I think I saw in an interview that you're writing a short story collection. Are you allowed to talk about it, or is that a secret, or have
No,
you?
it's not a secret. No, I am writing a short story collection. As I said, I love short stories. So I'm writing like a queer horror short story collection. Um, and yeah, I'm a slow writer. It's slow going, but it is happening. It's nice to be moving on to another project, and yeah, so we'll see how it goes.
Exciting! I'm so looking forward to reading it. Shall we go on for a lightning round? Are you ready?
I'm so ready.
Okay, let's do this. Okay, writing a novel is like fill in the blank.
Doing a puzzle.
Ooh, yes, that's a good one. Would you rather have to read your one-star Goodreads reviews every day and not be able to write for 2 years or go skydiving?
Read my one-star reviews.
Okay, so no skydiving. It's not happening.
Absolutely not. And I read my one-star reviews anyways, so
Okay, you're brave.
I
Now I
think
have to
they're
find. Is it good?
I think they're mostly funny. So
Okay, it's interesting. Yeah, now I have to find someone to go skydiving with because no author is like, I'm gonna go skydiving. So I'm just gonna have to
if
find
I
myself.
find anyone, I'll let you know.
Okay, yeah, something to do when I'm back in Vancouver. Um, Favorite writing snack or drink?
Coffee.
Coffee, yeah. How many cups?
I mean, I'm like a two a dayer. I can't really do more than that. Just something hot, I feel like. If it's not coffee, like tea, something warm.
Just so you have something while you're like writing. Yeah, at one point I was on 12 cups a day, but that was too much. So I'm cutting
Oh,
down.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm cutting down into I'm too caffeinated. Um, what are some books that you wish you had written or something that you admire, envy in other writers' styles or writing habits?
I mentioned this before, but Leanne Simpson's This Accident of Being Lost. Um, I wish I wrote that collection. I think it's so beautiful. It's like a collection of short stories and songs. And um, oh yeah, if I'm ever in like a writing slump, I'll just go back to reading that and be inspired to write again because I'm like, oh, I just want to be able to do this so badly.
Mhm. And that's really important advice for everyone. When you're stuck, go back to a book that has inspired or influenced you. Great. Um, 3 writers, dead or alive, that you would take with you on a 6-month residency on a tropical island, and why?
Yeah, so these are all contemporary living Nehio authors. Emily Riddle, Brandy Bird, and Selena Bowen. They're all like writers and poets. And I would take them because both I admire their writing so much, and they would just be a blast to be on an island with. They're some close friends of mine, and I'm like, any excuse to just like take my friends like on a trip where we can just write together and have fun, I would do that.
That's a good answer. So no zombies for you. No,
No,
no dead writers.
no, I don't want to have breakfast with a dead writer.
That would be an interesting story, I think.
So true.
Yeah, great, thanks. Most embarrassing moment at a literary event. You could skip this one, but I do want to know later.
You know what? I was really racking my brain on this one. I don't think I have an embarrassing. I think the most embarrassing thing that's ever happened is like I'll like us, and this has happened numerous times, so like I don't have like a one moment, but like I'll say something that I think is funny, like I'll say a joke on stage and like the audience, I won't get a laugh. That always sucks. So probably that.
hmm And sometimes it's not a bad thing because maybe they think you're being very serious, like you're being very thoughtful, right?
Right,
Yeah.
which in that moment obviously I wasn't. So just when something doesn't land, always
hmm
sucks.
Yeah, you just like, oh, I'll just work on my joke later. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least you didn't fall asleep. I once fell asleep during an interview. So
Oh no.
yeah, it was my own launch. Um, I was up, it was a long story, I'll tell you later, but I was up at like 4 a.m. and
Okay.
just like
Fair enough.
one of those things. And some poor audience member was asking me a question, and I think I just like dozed off for like 10 seconds and I missed it. Okay. And then our last question before I let you go, one piece of advice for aspiring writers.
Yeah, I think just like finding your what works for you for like a writing routine. Um, the same routine is not going to work for everybody. So like getting up early to write, it's not something that I personally like. Um, but I found as I was writing Bad Cree that writing late at night was like really beneficial for me. I was like a really big night person at the time, and so I would write for like a half hour every evening and take weekends off or whatever. And everyone has like a different method. Some people like don't write at all except for like, you know, they'll have like a couple of weeks where they write like hours upon hours, and then don't write the rest of the year or whatever. And I think just finding what works for you and sticking to it, is a really good thing to figure out who you are as a writer and how you are as a writer and like your best working conditions.
Really great advice. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for coming today. We're just so lucky to learn from you and hear you read. And um, I'm just, we're just thrilled to have you. And this is Jessica Johns, author of Bad Cree. And thank you everyone for coming. Let's all clap for Jessica on Zoom. I don't know if you can hear us. Um, and then I'm going to, I guess, stop recording.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.